it would be impossible to move forward with this podcast and not talk about what happened last weekend with Jon Jones versus Dominick Reyes. And this is how I feel. I feel that using the current criteria, Dominick Reyes won the first 3 rounds. He did more damage. His shots that he were landing were more significant. They seemed to be hurting Jon a little bit. They were backing him up. I know that Jon was applying constant forward pressure, but to me, that gets null. If there's like a really close round or a really close fight, that can be a deciding factor, like where you don't really know who won. But when you've got a guy who's landing more significant shots and hurting you and landing with head kicks and he knocks you down in the first round, I mean, like, to me, it was pretty obvious that Dominick, using the current criteria, won the first 3 rounds. I thought he did. I don't know. I don't think it was robbery. I think that third round is a little bit subjective. But I think if you gave the first 2 rounds to Jon, you don't know what the fuck you're watching. I'm just being honest. I think that the toss-up round was round 3. I think Jon won rounds 4 and 5. But if you're using the current scoring criteria, I give it to Dominick Reyes. I think he just barely won, and the third round was closer, but I still think he did a little more, right? Okay, so my main problem, I mean, the guy who gave it 49-46 to Jon, ridiculous. A lot of things to talk about here and unpack, kind of. First, I want to start with, like, the idea that in order to beat the champ, you need to beat the champ. That's dumb. That shit is one of the – I hate that fucking saying. Like, to say that you go through all these rising contenders, right, and that you earn a title shot finally and that you finally have proven to yourself that you're worthy to fight the guy who holds the belt. Now, you're not allowed to just beat him marginally. You have to dominate him in order to win the belt. That makes zero fucking sense. Scoring should be consistent in that regard across the board. Whether it's a 3-round fight or whether it's a 5-round title fight. Doesn't matter. You should be being objective about the outcome of the fight. I don't believe in that shit where you say, oh, you have to go out and dominate the champ and do this to him and do that to him or knock him out. No, that's fucking bullshit. That's some of the stupidest shit I've ever heard in my life. You should be viewing the fight as if neither of them have a belt and they're just fighting, and you should give the winner of the fight the victory accordingly, right? Now, so that's how I feel about that statement. Like, just because you hold the belt doesn't mean that you that's like giving him free points. I mean, that's really what it's like. That's like saying, okay, well, yeah, you might have won, but like he's the champ. Like, so what? He just gets free points? You're saying that the rounds don't start off even? That's ludicrous. It's like giving someone extra when they start the fight. It's like giving the champion a head start, which is total bullshit. Both guys prepared for the fight. Both guys made their way to the fight. They both stepped into the octagon. They both cut weight. It should be fucking completely and entirely objective. All right, so that statement pisses me off every time I hear it. Second, and you'll hear guys like John Kavanaugh and Joe Rogan talk about this, and they, in my opinion, are 100. Now, this is going to lead into what I think is wrong with the scoring system, but they're 100% right. I think that rounds 4 and 5 should mean more, right? And this is why. Not only if you're approaching the end of the fight, are you getting closer to simulated death and exhaustion between the two, but also in the first, like, the problem with scoring is that you are scoring it live, right? Like, when round 1's over, you have to give a score for round 1. When round 2 is over, you have to give a score for round 2. When round 3 is over, you got to, all the way through 5, right? The problem with that is that scoring fights does not have the gift of hindsight. Like, you don't have that gift. So you can't look at rounds 4 and 5 and look at what's working and go back and change your score for rounds 1, 2, and 3. And let me kind of elaborate on what I mean. So Jon, throughout the duration of the fight, applied constant pressure. And he weathered the storm from Dominick Reyes early, right? So while on paper and using our current scoring system, he might have won, or he might have lost those rounds. The dividends of that constant forward pressure and constant kicks and volumes, he might not have been landing the bigger shots, but you got to see that towards the end of the fight in rounds 4 and 5, Jon's strategy was ultimately better than Dominick's. He started to reap the benefits and, really get rewards out of the seeds that he planted in the first 3 rounds, even though he might have lost those rounds. And then in championship rounds 4 and 5, like I said, you're starting to reap the benefits of those, and you got to see like, oh, wait, yeah, what Dominick Reyes did in rounds 1 through 3, extremely good. I mean, impressive, man. He was hurting Jon. But as the fight wore on, didn't really matter. Nothing that Dominick did early in the fight paid dividends later in the fight where they did for Jon. And I'll give you another example. Colby Covington versus Kamaru Usman. Colby Covington may have had rounds where he definitely won and outstruck and, rocked Kamaru Usman. There were definitely moments in the fight where it went that way. But Kamaru Usman religiously dug the body with that front kick over and over and over again. And even though Kamaru Usman may have been losing those rounds, in the 5th round when he knocked Colby Covington out, you got to see the dividends that the body shots played in him, like being able to execute his game plan. So while he might not have been winning the round as it was live, the seeds that he were planting with those front kicks paid off in the later rounds. And like I said, there's no real way to go back and there's no way to go back and change your score for the first 3 rounds after knowing that what Jon did paid off later. So that's another argument for adding more weight to the end of the rounds, right? And this is how I kind of think MMA should be scored, and I've said this before on this podcast. This is how I feel about it, right? I think that when you have a 10-9 system, it makes it easy in a very close fight to just kind of say, well, I think this guy won. I'm going to give him 10 points and the other guy 9. Fuck it. Not a lot of thinking involved in it, right? So that's a problem. You obviously have incompetent judges, but when people can just mark down 10-9, and I mean, for a fight to be a 10-8, for you to get that gap, it has to be glaringly obvious. Like, I think about 10-8s, if you have a friend with you who has never watched fighting in their life or doesn't understand fighting, and they're able to watch a fight and decide who won without saying, like, I think, like if they definitively know who won, that's probably a 10-8 round on most scorecards. And the problem with that is that it's so obvious, and it doesn't take into consideration all of the nuances and all of the like different things that you can do in MMA, like submitting, like weighing submission attempts, and like there are different. There's like even in an attempt, there are like different levels of effectiveness. Like if you're just trying a guillotine and the guy slips out and he ends up in your guard and starts punching you in the face, that submission attempt is not as like. It's not as important as if you took it doesn't count for as much, in my opinion, as if you took someone's back and failed to rear naked choke them, because in one instance you had to work all the way to the back. The other, you might have just hopped up and pulled guard. So, I mean, there are little nuances like that all through MMA, all through it. And I think what you need to accurately reflect what's happening is because like, the other problem, too, is that a lot of 10-9 rounds aren't the same. Like, you might get a guy who, let's say 2 guys fight, and the guy in the blue corner wins the first round, but you're like, oh, man, that's a close fucking fight. I mean, he just barely won. That's a 10-9. The other guy in the red corner might come out in round 2 and pick up he might win, and he might win by a wider margin than the guy in the first round won, but it's going to still be a 10-9 on the scorecard unless it was glaringly obvious that he dominated. So you've got the same score for 2 rounds, and that's not accurate. This is just a proposal, and I've been saying it for a while, and it's kind of on loose legs, but I think about it a lot. And I think about guys like Yoel Romero who are religiously robbed of, like, fights that he probably won the fight as a whole but lost the round by round based on the criteria, right? I think what you do is you have 10 total points available, okay, for every round. And let's say that a guy, and you can scale this however you want. I'm using 10 because I'm a fucking idiot and can't add quickly, right? But let's say that a guy just narrowly wins a round. I mean, it's fucking razor thin. You might score that round 5.5 to 4.5, right? Now, in the same scenario we were talking about earlier, the guy in the other corner comes out and wins that round a little bit more significantly. Now maybe he got a 6-4 round. So now, I mean, you've got 6.5 plus 4.5, you've got 10.5, and 5.5 plus 4 is 9.5. The guy who came out and had the bigger second round is actually winning the fight, as he should be, because he won by a wider margin than the guy who won the first round won. Does that make sense? Is this making sense? And then maybe the way you compensate for like championship rounds and weighting them differently is in rounds 4 and 5, maybe you have 20 points available. And maybe that way, like, you can drive, like, I mean, in that case, it would be like, say one guy goes out and wins like a fairly, like he definitely won the round, right? Maybe you score that 12-8. And now your point margin is wider because you've gotten into the championship rounds, and it like kind of simulates that weight that we were talking about that rounds 4 and 5 should have. So you get like, as you increase the number, you get a wider margin for the championship rounds that can be added on. I think that makes the most sense, honestly. I mean, I know that's on loose legs, but I really think that would work. I think that like if you had the first 3 rounds be scored with like a 10-point gap or 10 total points available, and then in the last 2 rounds there were 20 points available, your incentive to widen that margin because there are more points available and further your lead is much greater. And those rounds are more important because not only are you like I said, you're simulating the end of a fight to the death, but you're also starting to see like in a 4 and 5 round fight is when you really start to see who like has the championship mentality and who has been, like I said, reaping the benefits of everything that they did, all the little things they did in rounds 1, 2, and 3. That's my personal take on it. Anyway,